Okay, hello everyone, how are you doing? Right, so there are like 16 people here, so let's wait a bit for everybody to connect as usual. As you've seen with the welcome picture, with the miniature, today we're going to discuss the last of our, it's not the last one, but the last we're going to study of the new ideologies and new political currents and political thoughts that developed in the 19th century. Okay, as a reminder, to start with, as a reminder, this is where we are. Okay, we're studying a new framework about new mindsets regarding the industrial age. If you remember, we have studied so far the one regarding the liberal ideology and how liberalism supported and accompanied the development of industry. That was the first one. And currently we're looking at the different forms of socialism. Okay, this is where we are, right? So as I've already told you, we also study the development of trade unions, but that will be more for the social changes and how the working class self-organized. I'm going to talk a bit about the trade unions today, these organization of workers. I'm going to talk about them regarding anarchism and how libertarian communism encourage workers to self-organize. Okay. Just a brief reminder of what we've done so far. Firstly, we have studied how the liberal ideology encouraged free trade and encouraged capitalism. Okay, that was our first study. And the fact that this has certainly helped the development of an industry, the development of free trade, the development of a capitalistic economy in the early and mid and late 19th century. Major thinkers, if we want to put this in a nutshell, major thinkers: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and for the French version, Frédéric Bastiat, for example, were examples of liberals. Then there was the development of a critical current, the development of a criticism of the liberal ideology, which you can call in a generic name called socialism. It started by a criticism of laissez-faire and liberal and free trade due to the social consequences. And that was especially the case of the utopian socialists like Robert Owen. Then you had a kind of, a symbolic change, more than symbolic, actually. It was a huge transformation in the socialist current. That's Marxism. And this is what we studied last time. And we've worked on this. Okay, so just summarizing once again. We've worked on how Marx was a critic of capitalism, because he said, in the end, capitalism will turn into crisis. His provision, his analysis, the analysis of capitalism led Marx to believe that there would be crisis of capitalism. And so this is where I stopped last time. And today I would like to study two things that Marxism. So this is where we stopped. Okay, so if you want to take some notes, all this, as usual, will be on Moodle, and you can find this on Moodle. This is where we stopped. Last time I've told you that Marx analyzed capitalism, but he was not only a philosopher, he was not only an economic analyst, he was not only an economist, he also was a political organizer. And that's something we've not mentioned yet. Okay? So this is where I'm going to start today. Marx believed that all the theory was developing the theory of the criticism, of capitalism, and the fact that capitalism was depriving the workers of their rights. You remember this? Here we are. The fact that when people work, the value they create is extracted by the capitalist. Okay, you remember this? That's something we have studied. And he said, okay, what should be done? What should be done politically to change this? How can we make sure that the workers, the proletarians, the people who have who create wealth by working, how can they get the power back, and the political power, but also the economic power there? How can they get back what they are due? They work, they create the wealth, and the capitalists take advantage of the wealth. How can that change? And this is the last element. And there are two dates. You should remember regarding this, and two dates that will leave a long-lasting impact, because these two dates, they paved the way for the communist revolution and the Bolshevik revolution that happened in the 20th centuries in many countries, in Russia, in China, in Eastern Europe, in some Latin American countries, in some African countries. In 1848, Karl Marx and his companion Friedrich Engels, they published a book called The Communist Manifesto. 1848, the Communist Manifesto, and Manifeste du Parti Communiste, as it was translated into French. This book, the Communist Manifesto, was a program for the workers to create new parties, communist parties or socialist parties, and the workers should unite in trade unions, so organizations of workers, and political parties to take power. They should be ready for the next stage, and the next stage was a communist revolution. How would that happen? Workers would unite, okay, and that's the slogan of the Communist Manifesto. It's proletarians of the world unite, workers of the world unite. And to reach this, Marx organized an international association, which you should know, which is called the International Working Men's Association. And it was created in London because Marx was exiled in London. That's something I've already told you when we studied the first 19th century, post-Napoleon Europe, that London was the place for many political exiles, and people were finding shelter in London because it was a place of political liberty and so on. So Karl Marx, he had found shelter in London, and there he created this. That's a date you should know. So it's called International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International. And it lasted for 12 years, okay, between 1864 and 1876. And the aim was to say all workers of the world, Europe, or all workers of the industrial countries. So the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, all the industrial regions, but also the USA, which was industrializing fast at that time. All these workers should unite to prepare for a revolution. Okay? Right? The problem is that there was a struggle. There was a struggle in the international association, in this international working man association, and that was the disagreement on the role of state. I'm just showing you this. If you still have the first mind map we made, if you have this one, in the different form of socialism, the major difference between Marx and those I'm going to study today, the anarchists, was that they disagreed on the role of the state. They disagreed on the role of the state. To put it very briefly, Marx believed that the state should be maintained for a transitional period. So let me summarize this for you. Before the revolution, you would have the state, with whatever form of government you want, maybe a king or a president or a queen or a prince, maybe a parliament. But Marx said all these institutions, even in democracies, are at the service of the bourgeoisie. They are at the service of the powerful. They are at the service in the hands of the capitalist. So to move from capitalism to communism, a society that would abolish the differences between people, between the social classes, we will maintain the state, we will maintain the government, but the government will be in the hands of the workers. Okay? So for Marx, the state would remain, but it would be at the hands of the workers for a transitional period. And then maybe in the end, the state could disappear because workers would self-organize. So I repeat, for Marxism, there is a state before the communist revolution. This state is at the service of the capitalist. It makes laws, it makes rules for the capitalist. When there is a communist revolution, the proletarians should take the control of the state for their own sake. So they should maintain the state, and the state would centralize production. The state would be responsible of production of goods, production of crops, production of services, but the state would be controlled by the workers. Okay? And then maybe after some time, the state could go, the state could disappear. But there were people in the internationalist movement, people who also were socialist and strongly disagreed with Marx. And these people were the anarchists. Because the anarchist ideology, or we should rather say the anarchist thought, because it's not really an ideology, is both against the state and against capitalism. Whereas Karl Marx said, maybe the state can help us at some point to move from capitalism to communism. Maybe the state should be maintained for some time. The anarchists say no, the state is bad in itself. The state is an oppression, and we should promote the self-organization of individuals and workers. And these currents, and that's going to be my final analysis, another mind map. I know you love them. So what they all had in common, we agree on this, what they all had in common, these people, was a criticism of capitalism. Some say we should improve capitalism maybe by transforming it, and these were the utopian socialists. Then Marx said, no, we should get rid of capitalism because capitalism does not work. So we should take the control of the means of production, we should take the factories, we should take the field, and the state should do that because the state will be controlled by the workers. And maybe later the state will go. Anarchists say, no way. If you want to get rid of capitalism, you have to get rid of the state. And if you want to get rid of the state, you need to get rid of capitalism. Okay? And this is what we're going to study today. So, just a bibliographical reference here, and it's going to be in French. I know that among the people that are currently watching this, are currently watching this, some may be interested in the political ideas. I'm here talking about people who are already studying social sciences in the university. I know there are some of you here. I also think of those behind their screen who may consider studying politics and political science. You can find this book on online shops as a used book for less than €5. It's called Nouvelle Histoire des idées politiques. It's by a teacher who was a professor. He may still be, actually. He may still be a teacher in Sciences Po. Okay, his name is Pascal Horry. He's one of the most famous historian of political ideas, and he wrote this. Two limitations to this book. Firstly, it's very European-centered. Okay, so it's mostly Nouvelle Histoire des idées politiques occidentales, mostly, not only, but mostly. And secondly, it's very dense for you. But all that I am saying during this lesson, you can find here presented much deeper. Okay, and what I like in this book, and I've had this book for 30 years, is that actually you have all the links between the ideologies. This book is showing you how you can establish the links between liberalism and socialism and Marxism, and how anarchism developed and so on. In case people are interested in political ideas, this is a very good book. There have been more recent books, but this one is really when you've read this book, you know a lot about the changes of ideas, especially in the 19th and 20th century. As it was published at the end of the 80s, you don't have much about the most recent changes in political ideas, but there have been more books about this. But really, if you can't find this book, it's in most Mediatek and so on, right? Also, you can borrow this, but it's really excellent. So, anyway, that was a break from our study. Right. Anarchism. As a general warning, yeah, absolutely, Flora. It's a book about political ideas by Olivier Nade. It's an update to this. It's much, it's more possibly summarized, and the advantage of Olivier Nade is that it includes the most recent development on political ideas. Yes, Alban, it is, because it's actually the program we're studying. Okay, let's move on. Right. Okay, can we start from what anarchism is? Anarchism is three things. Firstly, anarchism is an opposition to both state and capitalism. In the United States especially, you have had current of anarchism which are called anarcho-capitalist. Okay? I won't discuss them today because it's a later development. So, it's an opposition to the state and to capitalism. Secondly, that's very important, anarchism developed both in Europe and in America, and then everywhere else. But that's mostly a European and American movement. It's an international movement of ideas from the very beginning. And finally, anarchism has taken a lot of different forms. Okay? So, why am I mentioning this? Because when we study World War I, and that will come after the holidays for you, Premier OIB, we'll see that in the United Kingdom, anarchism was one of the major reasons, with religion, actually, with the Christian religion, it was one of the major reasons why people refused to fight and become something called conscientious objectors. They refuse to go to fight and say, because the state is exploiting us for war, okay, and we don't want to serve the state. And so it means that in the UK, in France too, but it was less important, but in the UK, many people refuse to go to war in the name of anarchism. So that's another reason why I'm mentioning this. Okay. What is anarchism? Where does it start? So 3 points. We're starting with point 1. Firstly, anarchism is based on the promotion of self. So this is something in common with liberalism. It could be something in common with liberalism, okay? And the man who developed this notion of the promotion of self is a man, a German writer. He only wrote one book, okay? And his name is Max Stirner. And Max Stirner wrote a book called, so in English, the translation is not that good. It's called The Ego and Its Own. I prefer the French translation, which is L'unique et sa propriété. And who is the unique? It's every single person. To say it differently, anarchism starts from saying no one belongs to nobody. That's Max Stirner's vision. Every individual is only their own possession. Or to say it differently, I have the property of myself. It's up to me to know what is good for me. It's up to me to know where I want to go. It's up to me to learn what I want to learn. It's up to me to act following my own values and not values which are being imposed on me. And who imposes values? The state. Who prevents me from doing what I want to do? The state. The state is oppressive. And it means that it has something in common with Adam Smith. It's promoting selfishness. But selfishness or egoism as saying, I am my own proprietor. I am my own owner. And so you can see, if that's the basis of anarchism, there are many things you should reject. You should reject the state because they impose laws on you, and laws you've not directly chosen. Okay? Secondly, you should reject religion, not faith, not believing in something. But you should reject religion like organizations that want you to believe something in a very specific way. If you're a Christian, there is one way you should worship God. If you're a Muslim, there is one way you should worship Allah. And so anarchists say, no, no way. If you want to believe, you can believe, right? But that should be your own choice. Thirdly, of course, why rejecting capitalism? Because in capitalism, workers have to obey. You remember we studied the rules of a factory, and the fact that workers had to stay at their position and they couldn't talk with their neighbors. They had to come at specific hours. And so, what does that mean? That anarchism started from a triple rejection of all authorities, state authorities, rejection of religion, because religion is another form of oppression, and rejection of capitalism and the factory system, because it imposed rules of other people. Okay? Right. So, that's something that would go to the anarchist movement, and especially one Russian anarchist whose name was Bakunin. I'm going to talk about him in a few minutes. And Bakunin said, state equals oppression. Why? Because the state is the organization that has got the means, the police, the army, the school, the administration, to impose things on people. So Bakunin said, the state is bad in itself. And so, what's the conclusion? What's the conclusion? Anarchism is based on this. That's the definition globally. If there is a definition, there is no definition of anarchism, but if you should retain one, people should associate, people should organize, people should cooperate, people should form communities, people should live together only on the basis of voluntary association. So, how this agreement should be obtained can vary. Some people promote individual contracts, like you have a contract with someone and you can break the contract when you're not happy with it. Some say it should be done on a local or regional scale. But that's very important. Anarchism said it's time for the people to unite, to associate only on the basis of the voluntary association. Okay? So that leads to two other consequences. Anarchists are against the notion of nation. You remember? Nation, imagine community. They say, well, why should we live together as French people, or why should we live together as German people? I mean, I should accept to be considered a French, or I should accept being considered a German, but no one can force me feeling a German or a French or an Italian. And secondly, as you can guess, they were also opposed to colonization, because colonization is clearly how you impose the rule over other people. So let's summarize. What is anarchism the way it developed in the 19th century? It's based on the notion that all individuals should be free, should be self-autonomous, and can only be owned by themselves. I am my own owner, and no one can impose anything on me. Let's make things clear. That includes, for example, the education of children. Anarchists consider that, of course, the kids did not belong to anyone, and they did not belong to their parents. And so it had a lot of influence on how kids should be educated. Anarchists consider that kids should not be educated by their parents. They should be loved by their parents, which is totally different. They should be given affection by their parents, but that society should educate the kids, not school. School is a place of oppression, right? You are being forced. So schools should be abolished. But if I have got some time, I will explain you how an anarchist education may work. Okay, so I summarize: promotion of the individual, an anti-state ideology, because the state is oppressive, and based on the voluntary association of workers. Okay, right? Now, second point, anarchism, as I've told you, anarchism is against nationalism. So it's against the feeling of belonging to a nation. That means that from the very beginning, anarchism was an international movement. And what I would like you to have, right, is that I'm going to give you 3 or 4 names of people who deeply influenced the anarchist ideology. Okay? I will mention 3 of them. Proudhon, a French, is considered to be the major, the father of anarchism, like the first one who had an audience to spread his anarchist idea in France and Europe. 2 Russian anarchists, Bakunin and Kropotkin. Okay, and finally, because anarchism was also a movement of liberation, it was a movement of women's liberation too, and I will talk about Emma Goldman. She's an incredible character, and I will talk about her. And finally, I will conclude by showing that as they were in favor of an international movement, they tried to work with Marx. That they belonged to the International Association of Workers, founded by Marx, but it was a failure because they could not agree on what would come after the revolution. So let's start from France. There is one name who's important. The name is Proudhon, and Proudhon is a quite interesting man because he was the first, well, not the first actually, but he was the first with an audience. Okay, he was the first with an audience to say that workers in the factories, specifically, he was interested in the factory workers, have the right to take the factories, to take the tools, to take the machines, to take the raw materials, and to use them for themselves. Just 1 minute. I have to plug in not to lose you. Okay, here we are. I'm sorry for this. Otherwise, it would have disconnected. So Proudhon, he was born at the beginning of the 19th century. Okay, he lived from 1809 to I'm just typing the dates in case you want them. That's for Proudhon. Okay. And he's very famous for this sentence: property is theft. Property is theft. What does that mean? That capitalists have taken property of something that never belonged to them. Proudhon said, machines, tools, land, raw materials, they belong to those who use them. they do not belong to those who hold them because they have the capital. So they don't belong to capitalists. If you're a worker in a textile factory and you use a loom to produce goods, even if the loom was bought by a boss, Proudhon say the loom belongs to you because you are the one that uses it. Okay? So it means that property is theft and private property should be abolished. Goods should be common. And when you need one, you take one and you use it. And once you're done with using it, then it goes back to the community. Okay? Good. So, absolutely, that's the difference between property and possession, or property and usage. That is, you can use things that don't belong to you. If we could say this, except for the fact that you pay for it, that's globally what public transport are about. When you take a coach, when you take a bus, when you take a train, contrarily to when you take your bike or when you drive your car. But when you're the passenger of a train, you use it for as long as you use it, it kind of belongs to you. Okay? And then, of course, when you leave the train, the train does not go to your home and say, hey, that's my train. I mean, it's a common possession. Okay? So, this is Proudhon's vision. Very soon, that helped Russian anarchists, so two names, Bakunin and Kropotkin, but you will find the name in the final lesson. They're Russians, but as many Russians, they had to leave Russia, as you can guess, because the Tsar was not especially fond of their. I'm going to answer your question, Kenzo, in a few seconds. As Russians, they had to leave the Tsarist regime. You can guess that the Tsar was not very fond of having anarchists claiming for the abolition of property and so on. So Bakunin developed the notion of social property. What is social property? He said, after all, people can have things. They can possess, they can be the proprietors of things, but we should privilege, encourage, and establish a collective and a common, a social property of things. For example, I'll give you one example. If you are a village of peasants, and there is a mill to grind the grain and make flour out of it and make bread out of it. So you may have a collective meal and you may have a collective oven to cook and bake your bread. That's exactly the type of things that Bakunin would encourage. Remember, he was a Russian, which means that he lived in a mostly rural country. So he could see how villages sometimes organized to have a common property of things. What Bakunin wanted was to make this system universal. Factories should be social property belonging to all the workers. So you can see why it's a form of socialism, because the aim was to create a kind of collectivization, but contrarily to what would happen in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Stalin forced the workers to collectivize their goods and their tools and their machines and their fields. Bakunin say that should only be done on voluntary choice. Okay, you can't force someone into this. So, what about timeless property? That was your question, Kenzo. It clearly depends. If that was something that you acquired and you've really used, and work on or work with, then you could keep it. That's the difference, for example, between a landlord, someone who would have a lot of lands in Russia or in France or in Germany, right? Grands propriétaires terriens, as we call them in France. They had hectares, hundreds, thousands of hectares of land that they never went to. And they had people working on this, right? Those we call les métayers, those we call les fermiers in France. That's one example. In Russia, you still had some serfdom, peasants that were attached to the land. Clearly, this should be taken from these people, taken from the landlords, and redistributed to the peasants. But if you read Bakunin or if you read some anarchists, if someone was, let's take an example. I've read a text yesterday and they mentioned this. If you are a shoemaker, a private one, you know, you're a petit artisan, as you would say in France, right? And you own your own shop. And you've got tools and you work on these tools yourself, you can keep them. There's no way it's going to be taken from you and given to anyone. Okay? Anarchism doesn't want to destroy all trades and all activities. It's just that they want the people who work to get the revenue of their work. Okay? If you are a shoemaker yourself, you will keep your machines and tools and property. If you are the owner of a shoemaking factory and you just have the machines, but workers work on the machine, then you should be deprived of this, and the machines and the factory should go back to the shoemaking workers. I don't know if I've answered your question, Kenzo, but that's globally the point of anarchism. So, property theft, Proudhon said. It depends. There can be a social property, but private property is bad, but there can be a social property. You're welcome, Kenzo. Finally, in the USA, so in the USA, you also had these reflections, right? But in the USA, you have this figure which is quite important. Her name is Emma Goldman. And if you ever had the opportunity to read her autobiography, it's called My Life, which is a perfect name for when you write your own biography. My Life by Emma Goldman. You will see that she had an extraordinary life. And I will answer your question, Juliette, immediately. Emma Goldman, today maybe she would be called a feminist, but she never defined herself as a feminist, because she says feminists, they tend to forget the most important element: class warfare. Feminism is not women versus men, it's exploited people versus capitalists, proletarians versus capitalists. And some women are proletarians. And so she said, anarchy is, of course, the best way to liberate women. Why? She said, and that's an interesting point, because women suffer, that's her analysis, right? Women tend to suffer from three oppressions, right? They are oppressed as any other individual by the state, like kids, men, elderly people. The state is an oppression because the state forces you into doing things you may not want. So women are oppressed by the state as any other individual. Women from the working class are oppressed as working class. They're oppressed by the capitalist system. They're oppressed by the factory working conditions. They're oppressed by the housing conditions of the poor people. Finally, women are oppressed by the social roles, okay, and the patriarchal society. The best example of women's oppression is marriage. In a marriage, right, especially in the 19th century, most revenues would be very unequal. And so clearly husbands would have a financial capacity, even husbands from the working class would tend to earn more than their wives. So she said, by being anarchist and by promoting the liberation of individual and the free association of all individuals, women will be liberated three times. They'll be liberated from the state, they'll be liberated from capitalism, and then they'll be liberated from the family that oppresses them as mothers, as spouses. And that's a quite interesting vision, because at the same time in Europe, you had women like Flora Tristan or Louise Michel that would develop and they were both inspired by anarchism, especially Louise Michel, right? She played a huge part in the Paris Commune, right? And she was exiled for this reason. She was sent to New Caledonia to keep her far away from France, from the France center. And they say the same, right? That, for example, marriage with legal prostitution was like the man brings the money and the woman brings the flesh and the sexual relations. And so one way to liberate women from marriage was to create a society where all types of oppression would be abolished. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you all this because the next study we have is about the social changes. And really, I want you to understand this. Maybe anarchism as a political movement has failed to set up a new system. There were very few full-scale experiences of anarchism. There were some. La Commune de Paris is one of them. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, there were some anarchist experiences. The communities, the libertarian communities in the USA. So there have been small-scale experiences, but there never was something like an anarchist state, because by definition it's totally an oxymoron. But listen to me. Anarchism has really infiltrated much of society by diffusing the notion that individuals had rights that were more important than what the state would force you to do, than what religion would force you to do, than what society would force you to do. And clearly, part of the individualistic conception we have today is a legacy from anarchist thought. So if I wanted to be caricatural, but I don't want to be caricatural, but let's summarize this. If anarchism on a long term has been a huge political failure, today in the world it's hard to find an anarchist society somewhere, say for small groups, very small groups. On the other hand, in terms of intellectual, political, social, moral influence, I think it's been a strong legacy. Okay? And that the feminist movements that rose against in the 1970s were clearly inspired by anarchism in its process of liberation of people. Okay? There is a question. Okay, I just would like to conclude by saying, how did they act? So I will do this. To answer one question we have here, anarchists, contrarily to Marx, who never wrote any book, Marx has written no book on what should a communist society look like. What should a Marxist society look like? You have nothing about this in Marx's books. Most of Marx's works are: how does the capitalist system work? What should we do to get rid of the capitalist system? And what should be the transitional period just after capitalism? But when you read Marx, you have very, very, very little reference to what should happen next. Contrarily to the anarchist movement, which has produced a lot of descriptions and portrayals and utopias, if you want, of what an anarchist society should look like. Just yesterday, I can send the link if you're interested to people who would be interested. I'm going to put the link in the chat immediately. Just yesterday, I've read a book which is called Idées sur l'organisation sociale. Idées sur l'organisation sociale is a book by a Swiss anarchist. His name is James Guillaume. He worked a lot with Bakunin, right? And unless I'm wrong, it should be there. Okay, that's perfect. Here we are. I put the link in the chat if you're interested. And James Guillaume, the book, L'idée sur l'organisation sociale, is exactly this. How should an anarchist society work? And how should it work after? And to answer your question, Juliette, yes, they knew that living in a town and living in a village and living in a hamlet would have a different type of organization, clearly. You're mentioning the kibbutz. Clearly, there was a huge influence of the socialist and anarchist, because many of them were Jews in Europe at that time, on the utopia of what a Jewish state should be. This is also why you had a lot of rural communities in the post-May 68 movement, you know, a hippie movement, or in France, the people that went to the Larzac to live in the countryside. They were inspired by the type of rural organization and peasants organization that anarchists had promoted in the 19th century. So, of course, you would not organize the production the same way in 100 people inhabited village in a rural place and distant place in the mountains as you would in Manchester, or as you would in Moscow, or as you would in Le Creusot, that is industrial cities with a lot of workers. Remember, anarchism is based on voluntary association. It means that you can't force the people into the type of association they want. And that's maybe the paradox of the anarchists. They say, on the one hand, we need to change the world on a global scale with anarchist ideas if we want to win. And in the meantime, they say, you can't force people on a non-voluntary association. So how will you get the aim? How will you reach the aim of having a global form of anarchism while not forcing people to become anarchists? That's clearly a paradox in itself. What was their answer? Education. You have to change the people into being more cooperative and so on. Okay? Finally, and that's going to be my conclusion for today, what should anarchists do to change society? And clearly, Marx had a solution. Workers should have trade unions, and one day there will be a revolution. There will be a revolution. We just need the workers to organize. Anarchists say there are 4 ways. And all these 4 ways were actually implemented. Firstly, create trade unions. Create places, right? Organizations, not places, where workers would unite to defend their rights. And these trade unions aimed at obtaining better working conditions. One very famous trade union was in France called la Confédération Générale du Travail, la CGT, the same one, but in between it has changed from anarchism to more communism. And in 1906, la CGT signed a charter called la Charte d'Amiens, yes, the same city as our president in Picardy, where they say we should have trade unions organization of workers. Why? Because one day there will be the general strike. And a man whose name was Fernand Pelloutier made a theory of this. What is the general strike? Who has the factories? The capitalist. Who works in the factories? The workers. Who creates the wealth? The workers. The wealth of the capitalist only relies on workers accepting to work. And la grève générale, general strike, but I say la grève générale because the concept was created in France, was to say, if we have a proper network of organization, a trade union for the railwaymen, a trade union from the rural laborers, a trade union for the textile worker, a trade union for the electricity suppliers, a trade union for the miners, the dockers, all the trades. And if these trade unions are connected in a single network of workers, like the International Workingsmen Association, then one day we can decide to all stop work at the same time. And in a few days, the capitalist system will collapse. And when it collapses, the workers will take the means of production for themselves. So, clearly, one strategy was to form trade unions to prepare for a general strike. I'm just quoting you an anecdote you may know. On the 1st of May, 1884, there was a huge meeting by trade unions in Haymarket Square in Chicago, and these trade unions were willing to prepare a general strike for reasons I don't have the time to develop, but it was a form of protest. So trade unions gathered in Chicago. That's just to show you it was also an American movement. And these trade unions were preparing for the general strike. And you may know what happened. The police in Chicago shot at the demonstration. They killed workers. Some workers were arrested. Some trade unionists were judged and hanged. They were killed. And this is the reason why on every 1st of May, on the prime day of May, it is the International Working Men and Working Women Day. It's not la fête du travail, it's la fête internationale des travailleurs. International Working Men and Women Day. That's to celebrate the fact that in 1884 in Chicago, trade unionists were killed because they were willing to protect their workers. Another possibility, of course, is to take part to risings or revolution. Anarchists played a major role in the Paris Commune. This is not my role to mention this. Normally, my colleague is supposed to talk about the Paris Commune, right? So I won't develop more. If you need some explanation on what happened, I will tell you, but that's it. Right. Finally, anarchists also promoted something called two possible ways of calling this: direct action or propagande by the deed, or propagande of the deed. In French, la propagande par le fait. What is that? Terror attacks. Attacking people that the anarchists consider to be the symbols of oppression. Attacking factory owners, or in France, that was the case at the end of the 19th century, you had a series of anarchist terror attacks, and eventually a president of the Republic, Sadi Carnot, was killed. A president of the Republic was assassinated by an Italian anarchist called Caserio. So what does that mean? That anarchists were ready to use violence, as communists were actually. That's the point which is very important for the later studies, especially in the 20th century. If you remember, socialism mostly started with a criticism of liberalism and a utopia, like how can we change this system? But that was the early 19th century. That was the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. This was before industrialization created the social tensions due to poverty, due to bad working conditions. And this is why the ideologies that oppose liberalism started becoming tougher, that they did not only define objectives to criticize liberalism, but they eventually defined policies to wipe out liberalism. To understand this fully, and this is the point you don't have yet, and that I will study next Friday, is that you need to take into account that these anti-liberal stances became popular because actually capitalism actually increased inequalities. Okay? And so people from the working class, they were less and less inclined to accept this and more inclined to violently oppose capitalism. This is the reason why capitalism eventually self-regulated. This is why the capitalist system included ideas from the socialist views to limit the risk of a revolution. I'll give you just one example. This is how kids were little by little taken out of the factories. The age for working rose. Okay, the age for working, the minimum age for working increased. That was due to the pressure of the socialist and trade unions. The working hours decreased. Working days could be 14 or 16 hours a day. They diminished to 10, then 8 hours a day. And that was due to the trade unions and socialist pressure and the fear that there could be a revolution. Okay? Right. So, as you can see, and that's my point, and I swear I'm going to conclude fast, like 1 minute. The 19th century was an incredible moment of political reflection. Several trades of liberalism developed: political liberalism, economic liberalism, philosophical approach, Adam Smith, economic approach, Frédéric Bastiat. Then a criticism of liberalism also developed, taking various forms: socialism, Marxism, anarchism. And these, and if you consider this, the society we're living in today still is, and you can see it in the comments that you have on the chat, okay, that our society is still mostly following the divide line between those who are inclined to a more liberal societies, promoting entrepreneurship, promoting a market economy, saying only capitalism can create wealth, and those who say capitalism is showing its limitation on the social ground, on the economic ground, regular crisis, and so we should incline to a more socialist or socially regulated form of capitalism. And if you're listening to the debate we have now in the crisis, that's exactly what we have. For example, should the state size enterprises? Should the state nationalize enterprises to produce masks? Should it? That's socialist. Okay, that's even, I would say, almost communist. Should we give factories to workers to self-organize to produce masks? That's anarchist. Should Amazon be allowed to reopen fully? It's still open, actually. Should all commerce, should all trades be open to be able to reopen because capitalism is the best way to get out of the crisis? That's a current debate. It's not pure theory, and the debate has not been has no conclusion yet. Okay, right. I'm sorry, I spent 5 more minutes than I should have. Do you have any question? My question is more for the Première OIB, the people who may have question on this. As usual, this will be on Moodle, and I'm about to have the full summary on liberalism, socialism, Marxism, anarchism put on Moodle too for you to learn. And not only learn, I mean, you don't have to learn it. You have to save it for next year, because we're going to need this next year for the terminal syllabus. So for the back, if there is a back next year. I'm joking. There will be one under whatever form. Okay, do you have any question, people? No questions so far? Okay, so I'm still waiting for a few more seconds, maybe for questions to appear. Right, thank you for being here, and we'll meet, as the Queen said yesterday, Queen Elizabeth II, okay? We'll meet again, she said, so we'll meet again on Friday. And yes, of course, Alban, all the new mind maps will be on Moodle, okay? So we meet again on next Friday, just before the holidays, and I'm trying to plan for the mock orals after the holidays, okay? So you will get a schedule for this before the end of the week. I will send you a schedule of the mock orals. Either we'll do them in the class or we'll do them on a distance like this, okay? Right? Good. Enjoy your day, enjoy your week. That's a very good question, Sarah. There was a huge debate, really a huge debate among the anarchists, and actually two tendencies developed in the anarchist movement. One that was absolutely, purely 100% pacifist. I can't show you the book because I've lent it to one of my colleagues, but it's still very common in the anarchist movement today to discuss how good is violence. And many anarchists say it's no good to use terrorism, because if you promote voluntary organization, you can't impose it. So these people, they tend to say anarchists should firstly self-organize and show how a collective organization can work. You know, it's more propaganda by being a model. Like, look at this, we have formed a small anarchist community, it works. And they say this is how it should be done. People should be convinced, people should be educated. This is a role of activists, this is a call of political commitment. We should persuade, convince the people, convince, not persuade. We should convince, because it's based on reason. We should convince the people that it's better to be anarchist. Some others said, but if we wait for all people to be educated, it will take millennia, centuries. So we should show them that they can today they can get rid of the state, they can get rid of the power, they can get rid of their religious authorities, they can get rid of their bosses. And maybe to show them that it can be done, we should show them how it can be done, like killing them or just threatening them. And if you want my personal opinion, but I'm not sure to give my personal opinion, but I think in theory, the pacifist anarchists are the ones being self-coherent. You can't force someone to adopt a system which is based on not forcing someone. If you consider that only a voluntary membership should exist, you can't force people into being voluntary, right? Except if you're Mao Zedong. That's for later. That was just a private, not a private joke, but that's something that Mao had as a type of policy, having forced volunteers. So I agree with you, Sarah. It's not logical. It's not logical. Okay. This is why many anarchists, for example, consider that Gandhi in India was a kind of anarchist, right? Because he promoted non-violence and he promoted the voluntary cooperation of people. Right. Okay. Have a nice day to everybody. Flora, you still here? Would you recommend the book Demanding the Impossible? I have to admit, I don't know this book. I have to admit, I don't even know the title of the book, so I'm sorry for this. If you want, I may check and see what it's about. But actually, I've not read it tonight. I don't know even the book, okay, and the title of it. Right? Okay. Are there any other questions? So, Sarah, I hope I have answered your question, right? Okay. Good. So it was a pleasure being there, and a pleasure having many of you behind their screens. Okay, so for those who want, see you on Friday, right? And please take care of yourself. We still have 1 week to go before the holidays. We all deserve these holidays, right? In case you want to read this, it's available as a PDF, and the third part especially, which is called L'anarchisme dans la pratique révolutionnaire, is quite interesting because it gives a lot of reasons why the anarchist movement may have failed. Right. See you, people. It was a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.